Maybe you could talk a bit about your training in Butoh, just to start
Okay.
off with.
Do you want me to look at you or look here?
I think you can just look at me, that's fine.
Yeah, I know, because it's funny when you upload videos, and your gaze goes in a sort of weird direction, So I think we should, if I'm talking to you, it should look like that when is that right?
I've never done it before, but it looks natural to me. It should be.
Fine, right. So ask me again, my training.
Yeah, so did you train in Japan?
Yeah, so my training in Butoh and how I came across Butoh, really, is that?
Yeah.
Okay, fine, yeah. So I wanted to be a dancer for a very long time. So when I was a child, I grew up and I wanted to be a dancer. It just never happened for various reasons. I was born in Wales and there was not much provision at the time. We're talking 1970s, really. And then I went through a fine art training and wanted to dance, still didn't get it, still didn't find it. And then I started doing independent dance scene in London in the 90s, early 90s. And then in 1992, I came across Butoh by seeing a performance at Sadler's Wells of Sankeijuku. And it was called Unetsu, the egg stands still out of curiosity. And at the time, the word Butoh didn't enter my consciousness, actually. It was more, I just saw this extraordinarily strange aesthetic experience. And I suppose something must have gone into my consciousness somewhere. And I felt a very strong resonance because my whole training as a painter had been very much in the same sort of world. And so I felt a resonance with this particular performance approach, even though at that time I knew nothing about it. And then by chance, I came across somebody who was teaching Butoh as part of their general sort of training. And then it was Ray Baskerville was his name, and he was introducing Butoh practitioners to the UK. So I went along to a few. I think the first two, I was like, not sure. This was 1992, 93, something like that, and wasn't sure. And then the third person was Masaki Iwana, and I found him quite a scary person, actually, quite strict and very quite direct with his comments to people. But there was some sort of connection in that workshop, and enough for me to go, yes, this is what I would like to pursue. That was actually very difficult because from that period, there were not that many workshops in the UK. And I was an artist, struggling artist, didn't have any money. So my training in Butoh has been quite strange and quite fragmented. So I encountered Butoh in those workshops, probably 1 or 2 a year in the UK. And then in between, what I did was I basically started a research into my body. And that was a very solitary, very long, sometimes very painful process of asking the question, how do I move? What is dance? What do I understand by the process of dance? So I suppose a lot of my work with Butoh has been autodidactic in the sense that very early on, I didn't really have a master as such, and I kind of wasn't that psychology to have a master, and I didn't really want a master. I wanted to kind of have the direct creativity that I'd experienced from a fine art training and then go through my body in a kind of independent research process. And then along the way, from about 97, I started to organise a lot of Butoh workshops. So I started what was then called London Butoh Network with a number of others. And we organised quite a few workshops. And then eventually it was just left to myself to organise. So I think from 97 till now, I must have organised over 50 or 60 workshops, inviting a huge range of Japanese practitioners and European practitioners, and organising at least 4 Butoh festivals and lots of events, So I've tried to kind of bring everybody under that umbrella. And it's been a really extraordinary journey, actually. So, where I was living at the time in Brixton, South London, I think virtually every Butoh master of significance from the first, second and third generations passed through my spare room.
Wow.
So I think it should have had the blue plaque on, by the time I'd left there. So, yeah, it was really lovely because I had very intense creative processes with various teachers. So, in a way, my exposure to Butoh was quite odd then because I sort of had a bit, did an enormous amount creatively under my own steam, and then, in a way, started to understand Butoh properly 10 years later.
Right.
Because, in a way, I had no internet, so there was no access to video footage. My first trip to Japan was in 1999, so it was like 7 years after I'd encountered Butoh, and that trip was funded by the Lisa Ullman Scholarship and what's now Arts Council England. And that was an extraordinarily beneficial time. In a way, I was I probably was quite overwhelmed by being in a non-European place. But so I probably could have done more than I did in many ways, but I did enough to feel that I'd connected to the historical roots of Butoh. I met Kazuo Ono and Yoshida Ono, and of course many of the other teachers. So the widow of Tatsumi Hijikata, Akiko Motofuji-san, worked in Asbestos Can Studio, met Kimito, worked with a lot of people actually in terms of training and interviewing them and talking to them about Butoh. So it was a very formative time. And then the last time I was in Japan was 2006, and that was to perform. And then all my masters turned up, which was quite a scary moment. So my history of Butoh has been quite strange, and not the linear pathway of many people who've gone into Butoh from my generation. So a lot of my generation, they stuck with one master. They went through either the Mintanaka training or the, Ayoka Ashikawa training, and yes. There was one teacher. But I think I was a bit more of a sort of free spirit, or sort of refused to submit to a master sort of feeling. Yeah,
I think it's really interesting you're talking about starting from an internal process, and as I understand, that's an integral part of Butoh, is a kind of internalization and kind of self-examination as a starting point for movement. How much would you say that is intrinsic to Butoh as a whole, and how would you go about cultivating that?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I think the most beautiful expression I can ever use to describe Butoh is step within. So you literally step inwards, and you might step inwards with your eyes open or closed, but either way you step inwards. And what do you encounter? You encounter many things which are unknown or unformed or unsaid or unseen. So, Butoh for me is a dance with the invisible, and we try to make it visible the invisible. So what happens when you step within is that you then come to discover that what you think is within is actually always in a process of formation and disappearing. So I think the question of the self is always therefore under scrutiny. What am I? Who am I? Where do I exist? So once you start asking the question of stepping within, then at the same time you're connecting to everything else around you. So I think Butoh can sometimes be seen as a very solipsistic kind of inquiry, a little bit self-indulgent or a bit of therapy. For me, it's quite the opposite, actually. It's you step in, and then at the same time you hopefully recognise the intimate and inextricable connection between all of us, so that the self is in process. The self is part of something much bigger. So that is the beauty of Butoh for me, is that it never stops at the tendency might be to get drawn into a world of emotions and conflicts and personal stories, and for me Butoh can touch on those things, and I think we inevitably, but embody weather. They say the body is like the weather, constantly changing, and I think that's so true of Butoh as well, is that emotions are constantly changing. The self is never quite the same in different encounters. Myself in relationship to a tree, myself in relationship to my mother, myself in relationship to my husband or my dog. So the question is, this self is constantly in motion, and I quite like that experience. Therefore, it's a dance experience fundamentally. That we're always in motion, and but the irony is that by going in to go out, then you find this extraordinary point of stillness, which is, precisely what's drawn us together. Is this point where there is a point where movement reaches non-movement, and existence reaches non-existence, and it's that interface which creates the still point for me. And it's that point between moving and not moving. So.
I think one of the fascinating things that struck me about reading. There's a wonderful book called From Without and Within about Kazuo Ono, and one of the things that stuck with me was the sense of that you're actually trying to create a symbiosis with your environment, so there's no sense of separation. So when you're talking about going in, but it's not a kind of self-indulgent, manifestation of just emotional states. I think exactly what you're saying is about going in to connect more strongly with what's outside is a great way of putting it. But the question is, I guess, then how does one, cultivate that state or start to find it to inform your own movement practice?
Yes, I think that's it. It's there are many ways in, I think, actually. Yeah. So I think obviously training is one way. So some people use exhaustion. So some people use physical exhaustion as a way to literally, exhaust the ego, exhaust the muscular body so that we can reach other layers. Some teachers use a process of really thinking, and conversation. So Kazuo Ono, for instance, he never really taught physical training. It was more like a philosophical enterprise. So you just talk and sit and talk and then dance. So I think that process of reflection is another way. That we find time to reflect on what we're doing and don't just do. So there's a lot of non-doing in Kazuo Ono's approach. Where you dance and life are inextricably bound. So you start to think about that, and maybe that brings another level of insight. And then there's other ways which are perhaps more meditative. So where I think for me, I take that approach a little bit more, where I'm quite interested in just making people calm down, really, because the speed of life is so frenetic, and I think very few of us have opportunity just to stop and to take that time to breathe, to relax, to literally look at your hands and go, gosh, I haven't looked at my hands in so long, or just notice the details of your own body, really. I think people are more attuned to their cars or their computers. Sometimes we sort of don't stop and look at things and experience our bodies, really, truly inhabit them. So I think when you truly start to inhabit your body and belong, feel like it belongs to you, it's not just a sort of thing to take you from A to B, then I think another process of settling happens. And then it's possible to find that quietness that's really kind of needed for a creative process. I mean, even the quietness can produce something quite frenetic or tortured, or a scream even. But there still needs to be that point of ability to go in, and that requires a certain level of settling, stillness,
and presumably concentration as well. And
yes, exactly. How to cultivate concentration. Yes.
And just picking up on what you were saying a bit about speed, I know that Butoh is associated with slow movement. Is that always the case, or can there be exceptions to that, do you think?
Yeah, I think Butoh is any speed, but I mean, I've been thinking a lot about time and speed, and recently, well, I think about it all the time probably, but more consciously recently. And I think Butoh obviously is associated with slow motion, and that's its almost trademark. In the same way that there's the absolute stereotype of Butoh dancers that they wear white paint, which I've never done in my entire career. And in fact, Hijikata's early work, he never used white paint. In fact, most of it he didn't use white paint. So there's those kind of stereotypes, and I guess slow motion is another kind of stereotype for Butoh as well. So, for instance, Akira Kazai is a first-generation Butoh dancer, and he's always danced really fast. And really impulse-driven and very frenetic. And in fact, Hijikata's early work was almost like live art, performance art. He was stomping around the stage and doing bits of flamenco and just crazy, like really almost Afro-Caribbean sort of rhythms, with the pelvis kind of thrusting away. So really different from our stereotype of Butoh. It's really, really slow. However, having said that, I think for entry into Butoh, I really value slow motion, because I think it does induce another level of consciousness, another level of awareness, another level of connectivity. So I think slow motion has a beautiful value, and it's often from the slow that we can then appreciate all the other rhythms that are happening within the body. So listening to the heart, listening to the pulse, being able to receive the wind outside you, or receive an impulse from another person to move you. So these kind of produce other kinds of rhythms and temporalities as a result. So I think slow motion for me is very much a kind of foundation or a base, much to grow. And some people stay there. I mean, some people are so happy to stay in the world of slow motion. And I have people in my class, for instance, who've been with me in my private class for 7 or 8 years, and they're just so happy to stay in slow. And I'll sometimes say, some of my students, okay, come on, let's move a bit faster now, and try all the exercises in the planet, and they will start to move faster, but always the default is slow. And that's fine. Everybody has their own sort of draw. People are drawn into things and for different reasons, and there's a value in that as well. But I think Butoh can be any kind of speed, actually. Pedestrian, frenetic, fast, slow, but it's more it's more that we're conscious of the question of time. Not that rest of dance isn't, but historically dance has so much been driven by musicality and by the rhythms of the music itself, even the kind of fragmented rhythms of Stravinsky, for instance, with crash. But Butoh often abandons musicality, often abandons rhythm in search of atemporality or the spaces between sounds. In Japanese philosophy, there's this word ma, M-A, which means very reductively emptiness, or the space between things. So I think it's that temporal plane of the sounding and the silence. Again, it's that another interface of sound and silence, and how do you work with that, and therefore what temporality does that induce? So they're all connected to my mind. Space and time are indivisible.
And what about when you are working with slow motion movement? Are there other qualities that are kind of implied by working slowly? And for example, I've trained a bit in the method of Tadashi Suzuki, and that also uses slow movement. And it's not just about slowness, but it's also about gradualness and making those very difficult transitions where the body would usually, want to give into gravity, and making those as smooth as the ones that are easier to execute.
Yes, exactly. Yes, No, an extraordinary sense of control is needed actually to work with slow motion. So there's a kind of paradox where you're trying to do what should be an easy movement in many ways, like just go slowly to the ground or just stand up slowly. But the body becomes extraordinarily confused because you are suspending the normal muscular and skeletal frameworks that are used in a way, and you're asking the body tremendously difficult things. I'm sorry, my poster's just arrived. So you're asking the body to go through quite a lot of stress sometimes, just to be able to stand up. So that actually means that we then have to draw upon other resources, and there is that sort of thing where you see people moving very slowly, and there's a tremendous amount of muscular effort going in to make something look beautiful and seamless and effortless. And that's the quality of a really good Butoh dancer, actually, if they can make something very simple, but look effortless, and there's a great deal of effort going in. So, but it doesn't look like it.
I think that's such a great point as well, because somebody could imagine that a slow movement, if we just moved our hand slowly like this, that's slow motion. But Butoh is so much more than that, because there's such an intensity of expression in each moment. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about the relationship between, emotion and expression and Butoh, and what that means or doesn't mean. Is it a complete kind of disconnection from personal emotions, or is it completely going into them, or is it a combination of both?
I think Butoh has a very complex relationship between movement and expression and emotion, and they all tend to get very much put together, into one big block. So to unpick it, I think the best Butoh dancers, experience as vessels or conduits, or there's a sense of openness. So you don't get stuck in your emotional frameworks. So emotion is often the tool to generate material. So it may well be, so for instance, my solo Mythic, which was my last solo that toured actually, in 2010, 11, 12. And that was based on the death of my grandmother. Now, to make that work was extraordinarily emotionally demanding. So I was very close to my grandmother. It was a very emotional piece. And I know that the material I generated came from that emotion, but there was no way that performatively I was going to allow that emotion in its raw state to manifest for an audience. So we always have to use maybe things as triggers or as starting points, but then be able to codify, to be able to give form to be able to go beyond the very personal, statement that maybe started the whole thing, and open it up to other people and to other audiences, and to make it more relevant to those around, to those watching. So for me, that means that we have to then work with, to a certain degree, form. If it's not an improvisation piece, I'm not talking about pure improvisation here. So, to a certain extent, create structures and forms which maybe resonate the original intention. So I think once one finds resonant material of some kind, or resonant physicalities, or resonant posture, or resonant moments, then that's the start of a journey in terms of creating something for somebody else, not just yourself. Yeah. So, and in terms of emotion and movement, I think this is quite complex, actually, because in a way you have to be able to let go of the feeling. You have to be able to mediate, but at the same time, it's through that process of mediation plus extraordinary embodiment, actually, that the audience is able to connect. So if I can lift my fingers, if I can close my fingers and make the audience watch that moment and be with me in that moment, and for me to be sensate to that moment, for me to be concentrated in that moment, for me to believe in that moment and receive that moment and to accept that moment, then I think an openness happens and the audience can enter. If I can be open enough not to throw that away, then the audience is able to see that and experience that with me. And I think that's where emotion starts. So emotion is not necessarily something that's just here. Emotion is a dialogue as well, potentially performance between the audience and what's being done.
To sort of pick up on what you touched upon earlier with the process of going from existence into non-existence as well. Certainly, when I did a workshop with Shononame Dance Company some years ago, one of the exercises we did was to repeat over and over again a gesture which had a facial expression with it. And we were to pick one emotion, and each time we repeated it, which went on for quite some time, she would just say, go deeper and go deeper into the emotion. And you would think, there is nothing left, there is no way further I can go into this. And she'd still be saying, go deeper. And at that point, I was finding that, I think partly through that process of repetition, that you lose the sense of the emotion. It's no longer there. There's a point where it disappears.
So where were we? Yes, being asked to go deeper and deeper into emotion. Yeah. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think, well, where do you go? That's the question. So for me, where does emotion really exist?
I think for me,
does it exist in doing, or is it a specific kind of, can you really, really ask somebody to feel more angry, to the point where it might change their body? So for me, I'm more interested in the question of,
I don't know. I think the realization for me was that, I guess that, I don't know whether this is a philosophy of Butoh at all, but that emotion is a kind of illusion, that once you start looking at it, it kind of disappears, which is what you were saying before.
Exactly. I think that's more resonant for me. Because I suppose when I teach, I don't really ask people to go deeper and deeper into an emotion. I say go deeper and deeper into a movement. And through going into the movement, you go further, usually into the emotion, if that makes sense. Because for me, feeling and movement are inextricably bound. So if someone is curling inwards, really, really experience the curling inwards, then that is going to generate a different kind of emotional resonance than if you're looking upwards, So the kind of posture of the body itself already triggers certain kind of emotional patternings or responses. So that's what I kind of tend to focus on, actually. So for me, emotion and posture and emotion and physicality are inextricably bound. That's not to say that it's very beautiful in a workshop environment where people do manifest feeling. It is not rare to see someone cry or just be overcome by sheer joy. Sometimes you can really feel that infectious joy in a workshop. But my experience is that I'm not a therapist, and so I always ask people to stand on the edge but don't fall over. So to recognise the feeling and to be able to pass through it and eventually let it go, and then see what manifested as a result. And then but the work with Butoh and imagery, I think, is quite valuable in relationship to this discussion about emotion. So what I try to do is I try to get people to work with imagery which may not have any connection with what they think they're trying to work towards. So if someone says to me, I want to do a piece about extreme fear, I want to manifest fear in my body and in performance, the last thing I would do is say something like, well, remember the last time as a child you were really, really scared, because that might be potentially quite traumatic to somebody, So what I tend to do is I tend to look for quite random images sometimes, and then through a poetic imagery score, sometimes then the physicality erupts, and you see it and you go, that's it. Your trembling rock for trying to stop itself falling over a ledge is fear. And then, and I often find nature imagery works very well for that, so that nature imagery and human emotion are often extraordinarily linked. And that's our genetic ancestral heritage, maybe. But so there's lots of ways to experiment with that relationship between emotion and physicality, or emotion and image, and emotion and emoting, and emotion of form, emotion and what the audience is receiving. Because for me, it always comes back to a question of the audience, and how can we really let the audience enter. And I suppose, extreme theatricality and emotion in Butoh often kills something. It kills the space, it kills the time, it kills the audience's ability to imprint, and to receive and to generate their own emotional scorings, which is often the mark of a more successful performance, actually. Yeah.
And how about the...
I might be wrong, though.
Certainly I've seen some Butoh performance where there was quite an extensive use of facial expression, and even the eyes were really used to an extreme where the performer would be crossing their eyes. Is that something that you've explored in your own practice at all, or is...
Yeah. I think the beauty of Butoh is that, unlike conventional contemporary dance training, is that the face is incorporated, the hands, the full expressivity of the face is a muscular organ as well as an expressive organ. So I think it's quite liberating to be able to break the social mask. Especially for women, I think, to break being beautiful, to sort of manifest, the strong sort of, your face as a kind of muscle, and I think that's, for me, that was very, very liberating when I first encountered Butoh. It's also fun, it's really playful, and you forget that, we've always got this sort of like face that we have to be perceived as our interface with the outside world. So I think, the kind of playfulness of that is very liberating. But I also think, the sheer theatricality of the face, that it can be seen as another part of the body to be played with, to be destroyed, extended. You break the masks of conformity, as it were. You break all the social coding. You break the, the gender sort of, gendered kind of icing on the cake, as it were. And you try to sort of break it all open and show other selves. And so yes, in some pieces like Black Mirror. Specifically, a whole section came from, that was a solo in 2006 or 7, and essentially one section came from remembering when I was 12, and looking into a mirror and thinking I saw something rather demonic because I was staring into her eyes for a long time, and apparently that is some kind of psychological trick that people can do to themselves. So, and then manifesting all of the faces that I saw. So, old lady's face, psychotic face, crazy face, child's face, shock face, horror face. So there was a whole section where I just dealt with this idea of looking in the mirror and what do you see? So hence the title Black Mirror to a certain extent, So I think, being able to break the face is a very liberating process and very valuable one. And it's another performance tool, because if you look to many non-Western dance traditions, Asian in particular, then the face is extraordinarily expressive. Everything. Natsu Nakajima was very, very good at, as a performer, at controlling every single part of her face, like down to her eyes. And, very, very beautiful.
Just picking up on your word playfulness there, would you say that as a starting point for Butoh, it's usually arising from a point of playfulness and improvisation? As I understand it, there aren't many techniques that you learn. I think in the beginning there's a slow walk, isn't there? I think. And did you?
I think Butoh is highly technical, actually. I mean, that's the funny sort of paradox again of it. So most Butoh dancers are highly trained. I mean, good Butoh dancers are highly trained. So you have to have extraordinary strength, flexibility, discipline, and the training of the spirit, as it were, as well. So to be able to have that level of concentration and engagement. That's not to say that untrained bodies or community bodies, applied theatre bodies can't sort of engage, because they can. But I think Butoh as a performance discipline, then the training is quite intense.
But does that training, does it consist of very specific exercises? For example, in ballet we have very specific things that we would do with our body to train. Does Butoh have a similar kind of repertoire that you would need to go through?
Yeah, there is, yeah. So there's different lineages to Butoh. So some lineages, as I mentioned, Kazurono didn't really do any training, although he was a very trained body himself, because he was quite fit. He taught gymnastics, and he was obviously very strong, and he'd done some German expressionist dance training and various other things, so he had some kind of training. And Hijikata himself had gone through various different dance trainings as well. So through the years, a whole system has been sort of transmitted through various teachers. And invariably, I think because I've studied with so many different teachers, then I can see the similarities, and I can see that they've come from this line of school or that line of school, and certain similarities start to emerge. And I would say that the influence of Noguchi gymnastics training, which is a kind of a system for training the body, which isn't actually gymnastics, it's a misleading word, is very strong in quite a lot of different teachers. The influence of martial arts, so some elements of Aikido or Shigun or Tai Chi emerge in various teachers. The influence of standard contemporary dance training, actually, so open, close, point, flex, is there, but again, it's put more into a kind of energy system. So, you're working a lot more with the plie position, but you're looking at your hara, rather than looking at a perfect turnout. So there are lots of really interesting trainings, and which I've gone through, and I think they're all very valuable, actually, because I think if you can open your body and have more possibilities for your body, then there's more expressivity. That's not always true, because having said that, so I'm kind of arguing against myself here, but I think, that is one way, especially if you're a performer. Having said that, I've seen many highly trained dancers, even within Butoh, and there is no interest for me they're doing, so, and I can perhaps be touched by someone who's come to my workshops even for the first 2 or 3 times and go, gosh, that's one of the most beautiful moments I've seen in such a long time. I didn't have to pay to see it, I saw it, and I was privileged to witness this beautiful performance moment. So, and they have no training, so it's a very, it's a difficult thing to really start to kind of pinned down, actually. I think it's impossible to have a final position on that with regards to trained, untrained, and Butoh, and what do you need to do in order to be a good Butoh dancer. But yeah, I think there's kind of sensible kind of parameters to a certain extent, certainly if you're dealing with this as a professional kind of experience. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to have to finish there, but just thank you so much. It was really fascinating to talk to you.
Yeah, lovely, actually, really good questions. So yeah, I kind of sometimes think from the top of my head, so hopefully afterwards I won't listen back and go, oh my God, what was I saying?
Oh, no, it was great, really. I'm sure people will find it very helpful to have an introduction before they do the workshop.